All right. So this is our first FPO learning sessions or FPO talks, wherein we try and meet with people who have been working with FPOs and try and get their feedback as to what their experience has shown them in terms of creating these FPOs, how the FPOs have progressed, and share anything else. So today to talk about this, we have Mr. Purushottam. And I would first like Purushottam ji, if you can please introduce yourself and a quick background as to what your work with the FPOs has been. I think that will set us before we start the interview.
Right, great. Yeah, myself, Puroshottam Rudraju. So I'm born and brought up in Hyderabad. We hail from a place from West Godavari. And then for me, farming and agribusiness is always my passion and always close to my heart. So that is what we started off as actually. And that made me to pursue the graduation in agriculture sciences. And then later on, based on the experiences that I had working with the farmers and the farming community, I realized that technology is one of the leading gaps. So that made me to pursue a course in technology management from Usmania University, right? And then I started my career with ITC Limited International Business Division, where I was actually working with the farmers in making them build their capacities. How do they orient themselves towards the export productivity? Because whatever the production that is made by the farmers and meeting the domestic requirements is no big deal actually. But when it comes to exports, they need to comply with the requirements of the international organization, international buyers, and international markets actually, and that makes them more prosperous because they actually look for something bigger. There is a big picture. They don't have to depend on the domestic markets. They are completely oriented in terms of the adoption of the good agriculture practices, in terms of the compliances with the international specifications and the buyer's requirement actually. So that is what I spent a lot of time in working with the farmers in transforming their value chains in terms of how do they improve the quality, how do they improve the compliances with the international standards, and then also the good agriculture practices, adoption of the good agriculture practices for improving their production as well as in efficiency in their productive best practices. So this is what I had done actually. And also with the food world supermarkets, I was actually the category for the fruits and vegetables, where again, I was working with the farmers in actually enhancing the how do they improve their practices to enhance the shelf life of the produce, which is very critical, especially in a retailing or merchandising the fresh produce actually, because it has to stay on the shelf. It has to appeal to the customers. Yeah, and those kind of things. So that has actually helped me in actually bringing the GLOBALGAP standard to India. At the time earlier, it was known as the Europe-GAP actually. European Retail Parties Good Agriculture Practices, but later on it being with the globalization, it has become the GLOBALGAP actually. So I started promoting in Maharashtra, Andhra, Telangana, Karnataka, and several other places where good agriculture practices can be promoted in big way. And part of it, I was also associated with the organic certification. So I was an auditor for organic certification. So I used to travel in India and abroad, certifying a lot of, inspecting and certifying a lot of this IC farmers group as well as this thing. And part of my journey was with ITC again. And then that is where actually I was started working with the farmer producer organization based out of Gujarat and several other places actually. So even in Gujarat, we had in the Kutch region also, Kutch Sajiv Kheti Manch, which was a farmers group actually, so which was later federated into a farmer producer organization. And currently with ICRISAT, I keep mentoring a lot of this farmer producer organization in terms of how do they leverage the value chains to strengthen their identify appropriate business models and work out the business plans for it. So, and I keep mentoring personally a lot of FPOs in terms of what could be the different revenue models or different business models that they can think about in terms of enhancing their enhancing their institutional building as well as sustainability of the farmer producer organization. I'm also associated with one particular startup from USA. It is called the Synergy Agritech, wherein they are trying to bring in what is known as the cooling as a service model within the country. So I'm just helping and mentoring them into launch this particular initiative, wherein the farmer producer organization, without much of investment, they can actually set up their own cold storages and then try to leverage market connectivity through the cold storage. So this is what the cooling as a service model that is by. So we are trying to scale up this particular business model across several value chains. It could be the fruits and vegetables, or it could be eggs, or it could be the jaggery, or several things. Even the farm ponds, whatever are being established. So how can we actually convert them into with the solar paneled lining, so that they also become an energy asset, and also it is like a fundable asset for the farmers actually. So this is the different models which we are trying to evolve, but of course the challenges are always there, and then that is how the transformation happens actually. So that's
All
a
right.
bit
So
about me. Yeah.
yeah, so it looks like you have a length and breadth of everything from when the farmer gets the harvest all the way to getting into the markets within the domestic market, also into exports, and you have dealt with licensing, organic certifications, and the whole 9 yards of this entire journey. So I think we'll try and dissect into several of these aspects from an FPO point of view. And I know that this whole marketing is a very complex beast when it comes to agriculture produce, but we'll try and sort of focus on from an FPO point of view, because that's a key area of focus given how things and policies are shaping around and the current agriculture scenarios. So I'll start with this policy document that was put out by the Agriculture Ministry, which says that collectivization of producers, especially small and marginal farmers, into producer organizations has emerged as one of the most effective pathways to address many challenges of agriculture, right? From access to investments, technology, inputs and markets, and so on and so forth. Now, in your experience, is it as simple as I'm starting from step 0, where a group of farmers, 10 or more farmers, just form a company under the Companies Act and they are good to go as a FPO? They immediately get access to credit and to the market. Is this process really that simple?
Let me put it this way, actually. See, the concept of the farmer producer organization is really a bit of a revolutionary and a bit of a transformative kind of a thing, because ultimately farmers as a collective can do really wonders, because they are empowered, their capacities are built, they are able to take decisions on their own. But at the same time, we need to recognize the fact that the farmers are their core competency is more in the production and productivity improvement, and less on the raising the capital in terms of the finance, or in terms of the market linkages, or in terms of connecting to the other value chain stakeholders. So it's very important. So this is where the farmer producer organizations should really focus on the management of the farmer producer organization, either through a CEO. He should actually focus on the other aspects of it, so that the farmer producer organization stakeholders, or the subscribers, or the shareholders and the BOD members should actually focus on the core competency of improving the productivity. And
so let me stop you there. So you said a couple of key things here. You said CEO, you said board of directors, you said then the members of the FPO or the stakeholders themselves. Now, who is the CEO and who is the board of directors? Are they also the farmers, also part of this whole FPO organization, or they are outsiders?
Yeah, see, the BOD members are part of the FPO. They are the shareholder members actually, and they are the promoters who initially start up, because as per the register ROC, the registrar of companies, it is mandatory to actually promote a farmer producer organization with a minimum of 5 directors and 10 members actually altogether. So they are the ones who actually initiate the formation of the farmer producer organization. So the BOD members are part of the farming or the FPO ecosystem actually. So they are older members actually. But a CEO is an appointed person who actually drives the business and actually takes care and manages the businesses of the FPO actually.
Okay, so it's the BOD that appoints the CEO?
Exactly.
Okay, and who gets to be the BOD? Like, are there any qualifications as to who gets to be part of that BOD?
The qualification is not a criteria, but necessarily he should be a farmer. He should actually prove it through either his own land documents or through any kind of a market sales. So that is what requires as a qualification to consider someone as this thing. But apart from that, he should also have a KYC documents in terms of a PAN card or any kind of a address proof and related things actually.
Okay.
So the BOD members don't require any kind of a qualification. So, but it makes sense actually if they are in terms of leadership skills or those kind of a things, which are able to influence the other members to subscribe to the shares of the farmer producer organization.
Okay, so what happens in the case of someone is a tenant farmer and can she be part of the FPO or only because she doesn't own the land documents, right, as such?
Right.
So who will become part of the FPO?
Yeah, in that case, then they need to approach the nearest village revenue officer and then whatever, like, because these are all very loosely kind of a contract farming or a lease models actually. Even a tenant farmer who takes it on lease, it is not documented actually. So, but he can actually get it validated through the village revenue officer that that particular parcel of land is actually leased to this particular tenant farmer. And then that is how it is. See, it is not a very religious kind of a thing that he has to be a landowner, but he can also prove it through his tenancy kind of a thing.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, got it. So, yeah. So okay, at this point, the FPO is formed. We have the members, we have the BOD, and then we also have the CEO. Now, what happens in terms of getting the FPO from setting up to making it operational? Obviously, I need the capital for that. So where would the initial capital come from? And what kind of credit do they have access to once they form this FPO?
Right. See, currently, whatever the farmers actually to subscribe to the shareholder share capital, what is really required is two things. One is the membership to the FPOs, which is very nominal kind of a thing. Most of the FPOs are taking something like 100 rupees a kind of a thing. And the other something like the share price is something like 1,000 rupees actually. So to begin with, what happens is some 10 members or 100 members, or it can be scaled up to 500 members kind of a thing. So when it is something like a 500 members, it is something like 1,000 kind of a thing. So it becomes something like a 5 lakh rupees kind of a thing. So when it is 5 lakhs kind of a thing, the government actually is supporting through the equity matching grant, which is almost like whatever, like if the FPO is actually able to raise capital to the extent, the share capital to the extent of 5 lakhs, another 5 lakhs is actually given by the Small Farmers Agribusiness Consortium through the Ministry of Agriculture and Cooperation. So that is how one part actually. But wherever it is required, the BOD members or the shareholders can also infuse capital in the form of debt, so that can be actually leveraged for their own development actually. Yeah, so those are the different forms of raising. Apart from that, the banks are also now in a position to extend credit because the government of India gives something called the collateral-free guarantee scheme actually. Okay, so to the extent of 1 crore of rupees is given by the government of India through the backing of the banks actually. Yeah.
And which banks are these? Are these rural banks or any nationalized bank or any even private banks can be approached for this?
Yeah, most of the nationalized banks are mandated to provide this kind of a collateral-free guarantee loans actually. But even the private sector, something like the ICICI Bank or the Axis or HDFC, they are also qualified to actually extend loans to the farmer producer organization.
So they can get a loan up to 1 crore.
Yeah, 1 crore.
With no collateral obligations.
Exactly.
Okay.
The government actually backs this actually. Yeah.
Okay. And how big the FPO needs to be for applying something like a crore? Like what is the criteria for getting collateral free loans?
Yeah, that is one of the challenge, because the NABARD has fixed up in such a way that it is required that at least they need to have 3 balance sheets. So most of the farmer producers should have a legacy which shows that they have good turnover, good profitability. Not for profitability, at least some cost to cost kind of a revenue flow that is happening actually. So those becomes very important for the qualifying for the those kind of a loans actually.
Okay. So they need at least 3 years worth of balance sheet to prove that they're financially viable.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. So now they've got the capital, they're all set up. And when it comes to the harvesting time, the FPO goes and buys out the harvest from the, or either the members or the nearby farmers, and they aggregate all this produce. From there, take me through how they manage to actually, buy this, like procuring this from the farmers. Do the FPO necessarily have the wherewithals to do this, like storage facilities, weighing facilities, grading facilities, and all of those things? Do they have access to this kind of infrastructure?
Yeah, but I think before I answer your question, let me go through the process actually. So what happens is, once the FPOs are formed, they necessarily go through the micro planning process actually. So micro planning is like trying to figure out how much is the output, what is the current, what is the baseline of the farmer producer organization in terms of how much of acreage they are growing, what kind of a crop they are growing. They also do the value chain analysis to understand what kind of interventions that are required actually. So that is where what are the critical gaps that are there, whether it is the market gaps or the financial gaps or the production gaps or even the technology gaps actually. So once these are identified, it becomes for the CEO or the BOD members to actually figure out or draw a mechanism to create those kind of interventions so that the value chain gets strengthened actually. Once those addressed, then it becomes easy for them to actually get into the different revenue models. So one of the revenue model is probably availability of the inputs. So it could be quality seeds, or it could be quality pesticides or fertilizers or herbicides or those kind of things actually. Once that is strengthened, then the other aspects would be the financial gap actually. So how do they access capital? How do they take care of the crop loans or those kind of things actually? So either they actually tie up with the non-banking or the value chain finance companies, or it could be the banking institutions or the NBFCs per se. So those kind of things are actually, it is like a one step after the other. It is like because as I mentioned, the BOD members, their core competence is more into the production kind of a thing. What really need to be understood is what are the other things that really matter actually, so that without creating any kind of a burden on the shareholder members. So it is always good to focus on the other aspects. So those kind of interventions need to be figured out actually. So most of the FPOs, what they are trying to do as a revenue model is set up a input shop, so that they can actually subscribe or obtain license from the fertilizers or the pesticide license or the seed license, so that they can actually approach the companies directly, provide seed, whatever seed, good quality seeds or the fertilizers or the pesticides kind of a thing, and supply to the FPOs at a very reasonable rates, so that at least at reduced margins actually. So even if they are getting something like a 20% margin, 10% can be passed on as a discount to the farmers, and the 10% is actually retained by the FPO management for their own sustainability. So this is one revenue model that they have been doing. And also in terms of the value chain finance, actually, so whatever that they can actually help in obtaining from the value chain finance companies or the NBFCs, what they're trying to do is that whatever they as a collective are actually applying to the value chain finance companies and raising capital, actually, because if individual goes and access the capital, it becomes a bit of a challenge, actually, because they need to go through the lot of documentation and lot of compliances and other things, actually. But when it goes as a collective, it becomes very easy for the farmer producer organizations to actually access capital, which is one of the critical input for crop production, actually. Then the other aspects comes in terms of the aggregation of the whatever is the output, actually. But before that, they actually take up the top-down approach. Actually, they actually try to work with the processors. So if I try to give you an example of something like a maize or a paddy or a soya bean or any of those products, actually, so they actually work with the leading processors, so that they can actually enter into some level of informal or formal contracts with the processes that, as per your specifications, specs, we would be in a position to supply this much of volume. So that is the kind of a market linkages they can actually come to. And most of the farmer producers are working in that particular direction. And what happens is, once they actually understand what are the specifications of the buyers or the processors, they are able to come back and tell to the farmers or their shareholder members that these are the requirements of the processors. So we should be in a position to orient ourselves to produce those kind of a quality specifications. So this is how the whole the process is evolving, actually.
Okay, that's very interesting. So you mentioned several important aspects. So one, you said the micro planning, which is once you get the capital, you plan as to what you need to procure from the processing, the input, subscribing to inputs, fertilizers and other kinds of these things. So in effect, you're saying that for an FPO to be, at least make an attempt at direct marketing of the farmer produce, they also need to have all of these things lined up before they can get into marketing their own produce, right? Yeah. Access to processors and those kind of things. Now, we will get into that, taking some real examples, because you said you work with several of the FPOs. We can get into some concrete examples to see how many such FPOs are out there and what your experience has been. But thanks for providing all those inputs, insights into what all goes in before they aggregate these things. Now, once they aggregate, now they've gone through the processors, they have now aggregated the produce. Who is the market at that point? Are they directly selling this to the customers, or are they taking it to the nearby markets? Because I'm assuming several of these FPOs may not have access to these so-called big markets, right? That we are used to typically seeing in the urban space. So who exactly are these customers? Who are they selling this to?
See, initially what happens is they also need to understand how does the whole process of aggregation and the auction process on the markets happen, actually. But thanks to the new laws that are framed by the government of India, where they have the right to sell it to anyone whosoever, actually. So, but before that, it has been happening, actually. So if you take the example of something like the Uday Agri, which started way back in 2000, I think 8-9 kind of a year, 2008-9 year. Actually, what they started doing is that there are several companies in and around their own production area. So they approach them and they try to understand what are their requirements, actually, and what are their buying procedures, actually, because this is what matters more importantly, actually, because the traders have access to those kind of a processors, and then the farmers have to understand, actually. And this is where the BOD members and the CEO, as a collective kind of a thing, they would actually try to understand the requirements of the processors, actually. So to answer your question, actually, initially it was all selling in the mandis and those kind of a things without much of this thing, actually, because they did not really understand the requirements of the processor. But over a period of time, when they realize that market linkages and less disintermediation should be the order of the strengthening the farmer producer organization. So they started approaching this processors, and for them what really matters is the critical volume or critical mass that is required actually, because at least there should be a truckload kind of a thing actually, because you cannot sell something like 100 kgs at those kind of a things. So this is where the aggregation happened actually. But more importantly, we need to understand that what is actually required. So it should be as per the specification. So when we are talking about the specification, something like the moisture becomes very critical actually. So we need to really understand what are the moisture levels that the processor or the buyer demands actually. So in that kind of a scenario, so once it is understood, they actually get oriented to what the buyers require actually in terms of reducing the moisture levels. And when it comes to reducing the moisture levels, that is the post-harvest processes what are required, either a dryer or an open yard or a drying yard. Those are the infrastructure requirements that actually come in actually. So this is how the whole value chain transformation happens actually. So, and also the value chain gets strengthened. Yeah, I think I tried to answer your question to some extent.
Right, right. Yeah, you did. So I guess in this entire operations, if we talk about even the existing setup that we have, there is always scope for exploitation. Somebody trying to take advantage of this. Even in the FPO kind of a setup, this can still happen. So is there anything by law at a policy level which ensures that, or which sort of forces certain level of transparency and accountability when it comes to FPO, like regular meetings happening with the BOD, how much is being procured, from whom, are all of this information being made available to all its members, shareholders? How is that maintained?
Okay, so the BOD and the CEO actually collectively, they actually keep everything transparent, and there is something called, as per the company's law, something on the patronage bonus actually. So which need to be given to the shareholders who are contributing to the revenue of the farmer producer organization. So there are that whole patronage bonus is one thing that ensures that there is a transparency in the whole system, and because they are the ones who are eligible for the patronage bonus, so they are made transparent about what is happening actually and what happened to their produce actually, whom it has been sold, what is the price it has been sold, what is the quantity, and what kind of any kind of a rejections or any kind of a discounts or any kind of a less price has been quoted, and all those kind of things are actually put transparently to the producer members actually. So once that is made clear to the producer members actually, so that is how the whole transparency is built into the system actually. Of course, apart from that, the regular audit and other things happen, but the farmers are always, the shareholders are always free to actually go through whatever the sales have happened actually.
Okay, I was looking for that word, audit. So
Yeah.
are these audits mandatory, and are these like done yearly basis? How are these audits conducted, and who does these audits?
Right. Actually, that's what. So what happens is, because most of the farmer producer companies are registered under the Companies Act, it is mandatory for all the farmer producer organizations to have all those kind of a good accounting practices in place, right? And at the same time, whatever are required actually in terms of the internal audit policies or the good governance practices, which are important actually. But the biggest challenge most of the farmer producer organization faces in terms of the revenue, adequate revenue to take care of all these kind of things actually. But loosely, it has been happening. I wouldn't say that to a greater extent it has been happening, but it is happening so that an internal audit or a CA firm actually carries out the audits on behalf of the farmer producer organization and the management, so that everything is, the governance is put in place actually.
All right, great. Okay, so I guess we've covered, in terms of setup and operational wise, what are the things that have to be done. Now, maybe we can focus the next part of the discussion on some concrete examples or some real life experiences that you have been through. So based on what you said, for a FPO to be financially viable, what do you think is the optimal number of shareholders or the farmer groups for the FPO to sustain itself? Given that the initial capital is coming from membership fees, what do you think is the correct size for an FPO to be financially viable?
Right. Okay. See, I would go in a different direction altogether. So, any company to be viable, there is something called the whole process. So they need to generate a revenue of something like 5 lakhs. So 5 lakhs is considered to be a minimum expenses of any kind of a farmer producer organization, whether it is for the CEO salaries or it is for the compliance with the company matters. So all these things require something like assuming that 5 lakhs is the requirement actually. In that kind of a scenario, what happens is they need to generate a revenue of something like almost like 10 times of what are they? So something like 50 lakhs kind of a thing. But to generate those kind of a thing, so we need to go back and then really figure out how much is the turnover that would be required actually. So once we have arrived at the turnover, we need to really look into how many members. There are two things. One is the membership. The other one is how much is the contribution to the share capital actually. So there are few companies which started off with a 1,000 rupee kind of a thing, but there are few companies which started off with 10,000 rupees as a this thing. It all depends on the kind of a value chain they are operating around actually. So if you look at the small and marginal farmers, it makes sense to start off with 1,000 rupees as a share price, and all the membership should be something like a 1,000 members actually to be a viable kind of a thing actually. Otherwise, what happens is and also to qualify for the equity matching grant by the government of India and to take the maximum equity matching grant, which is to the extent of around 10 lakhs actually. So if they are in a position to raise share capital of something like 10 lakhs, they get an equal amount of another 10 lakhs as an equity matching grant from the government of India. So to qualify for that, it requires something like 500 members, but it should be something like 2,000 rupees should be the share capital actually. So that becomes very important. But at the same time, any kind of a farmer producer organization to actually ensure that they are sustainable in the initial years or during the seed stage actually. So which is important actually. They need to sustain on their own, complying with the company matters and also in terms of whatever the manpower and the overhead costs actually. So those all need to be managed. So at least they need to sustain themselves for the first 3 years. If they are able to manage to sustain for the first 3 years, then we can consider that most of the farmer producer organization would be successful. Yeah. So that kind of a matrices, yeah, I would put it actually. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Makes sense. So in your experience, have you seen FPOs where they were small and marginal farmers in majority?
Yeah, a lot of farmer producer organization promoted in the country are the small and the marginal farmers. Whether we are talking about something like the RDT promoted farmer producer organization under the MAX law, mutually aided cooperative society law. So most of them are small and marginal farmers, and majority are something like the women members are shareholders actually. Yeah.
Yeah, that was my next question too. How many of these FPOs have women farmers and tenant farmers that you have come across who have managed to survive beyond the 3 years period and are successfully? Do you have any examples?
Yeah, 3 years, most of the FPOs are able to sustain for the first 3 years because of the supports that the resource institutions are providing or the government of India is directly providing actually. So that way, most of the farmer producer organizations are able to sustain. But again, coming back to the actual scenario, what is happening is most of the farmer producer organizations are promoted by the not-for-profit organization or the NGOs actually, which have a strong competency, especially in terms of the social mobilization and the creation of the social capital. But what is really required for the sustainability of the farmer producer organization is the business acumen or the business orientation actually. So they need to really look into how not just mobilizing the shareholders, but what is really important is that they need to sustain with adequate revenue models. Otherwise, what happens is how do they survive beyond those 3 years?
Right.
After the completion of the project, actually.
Right.
Whatever the central support is stopped, actually. Yeah.
Right. Now, you mentioned in our earlier part of discussion about the role of the BOD and the CEO to come up with a vision for the FPO, the business strategies, the revenue models, and all of this, right? But in your experience, how many FPOs have had such BODs and CEOs who have had this business knowledge to think like somebody who's running a company and drive that company towards earning profits, not just for the FPO, but also for their shareholders? If you can draw parallels between the two, how many such FPOs have you seen where the BOD members and the CEOs who actually had that kind of knowledge and the wherewithals to do that?
Right, yeah. I'm sorry, there's some internet. Yeah,
Sure.
Okay, fine now. Right, okay. So, like, that's what, again, I'll come back to the same, this thing. Actually, it all depends on the vision and the leadership that really matters, actually. So, if I give you a classic example, like this Sahyadri farmer producer company based out of Mohadi in Nasik, actually. So, that is not a benchmark for, to actually work, to really look at the farmer producer organization. But rest of the other things, like largely they have been promoted by the resource institutions or the CBBOs, which are actually promoting the farmer producer organization. And currently there are something like 7,000 plus farmer producer organization in the country. And then added to that, another 10,000 farmer producer organizations are going to be promoted under the new plan, actually. So given this kind of a scenario, I would only talk about the 7,000 farmer producers that have been promoted earlier, either by private initiatives or the resource institution promoted farmer producer organizations, or the NABARD promoted farmer producer organizations. So if you look at those kind of things, actually the evolution or the genesis of those kind of a farmer producer organization is either through their existing farmer groups, which are either the water user associations or whatever, or those kind of a related kind of a organization, or commodity interest groups, or the farmer interest groups, or those kind of things, actually. So those have been actually transformed into the farmer producer organization, actually. So for them, they were actually backed by the not-for-profit organization, and then the NGO sector in terms of strengthening in terms of the capacity building and empowerment kind of a thing. So my rough estimate would be like only 10% of the FPOs were able to sail through the 3-year path and able to comply or generate adequate revenue to sustain for the next 3 years. I would put it that way, actually. Yeah, which is a very small figure, but it is good enough to set the direction and have a long-term strategy for how do we strengthen the farmer producer organization and in terms of making them more profitable and viable. Yeah.
Right. So you're saying that we have a precedence as to how FPOs can be made financially viable, and that's the 10% number that you have given. But what happens to this 90% of the FPOs that are unable to survive? Do they just sort of, have a complete breakdown, or do they still, put band-aids and try to get up and still walk and run, however much they are able to do that? What happens to them?
Yeah, that's what is really required is reorientation. So something like any kind of a concept or any kind of a initiative or a policy that evolves, actually. So what is really required is we need to roll out, and then the second stage would be fix up all those kind of as you mentioned, something like a band-aid kind of a thing, but we need to reorient them towards the business, actually, because it is very clear, actually, because if you look at the FPO Act, actually, this thing, so it was founded with a vision to actually strengthen the institutional building of the farmer producer organization, and they have been given a choice to register under the Companies Act. So Companies Act is very clear that it has to be profit oriented kind of a thing, and they need to be business oriented actually. So this is where the strategy comes in actually. Okay, initially you have rolled out the farmer producer organization, but what really is required is you need to fix up those kind of a whatever the loose ends that are there actually, whether it is in terms of the business strategy or a business plan or revenue models, or how do they actually evolve into the next orbit. That becomes more important actually. And then the third thing would be obviously how do they scale up actually their business opportunities. There are n number of opportunities that are available actually, but they need to figure out what really matters and how do they embed those kind of strategies into their business plans. Yeah.
Right. And do they have the necessary support structure to sort of do this kind of reorientation? Right? Who do they go to?
Yeah, that's what. Again, what is happening is now the project management agencies have been appointed, wherein they will actually help the CPBOs. Okay, so they are the ones who are going to this thing. But I'm sure with the new kind of a vision that is coming in with the 10,000 FPOs, I think there is adequate support that is coming from the government in terms of the government has realized that the farmer producer organization, the FPOs are going to be the future institutions for strengthening the farmers and their ecosystem actually. So to enhance those kind of a things, what is really required is the business orientation. So if we can actually impart at least 10% of the business acumen into the shareholders and the BOD directors and also the CEOs, then I think the purpose and the mission of the FPOs could be served to a larger extent. Yeah.
Right. So far as on date, there is no such support structure that exists in the rural areas wherein this kind of help can be rendered to the FPOs when they need them.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this is where the technology can play a very meaningful role actually. So this is the time of virtualization. So most of the FPOs they do not have any kind of a technology support. A few players are there, something like the I'm not able to this farm ERP or the crop-in, those kind of source trace or those kind of a ICT kind of a thing. But what really is more important is that aggregation and marketplace economies, those kind of emerging technologies, they need to be put into place so that the farmer producer organization focus on their core competencies and someone else is actually taking care of those activities or the competencies actually. So when the aggregation, suppose if I'm trying to mention something on the input requirement, so suppose a farmer producer organization require inputs, but unless and until it is aggregated and then the critical mass is generated, so we cannot actually approach the fertilizer companies to actually have a better negotiation or a better bargaining ability, so that the farmer producer organization can be provided with those kind of a critical inputs at a very competitive prices actually. And also it comes to the marketing actually. So marketing also we need to really get into those kind of a technologies where either this the aggregation models or the marketplace models, so that actually they can actually start looking at this is the kind of a things that are required and this is the kind of a infrastructure that is there, and how do we put that infrastructure, put those kind of a commodities into the infrastructure, whether it is the warehousing or those kind of a things, and then generate warehouse receipts or actually do the documentary trade rather than a physical trade of the commodities actually. So this is where the technology can have a very meaningful role and a very transformative role. Yeah, that's what I want to put in actually. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So now we'll move into the final section of the discussion. I wanted to know any examples, an example where you have the FPO in the 10% which have survived these 3 years. I mean, Sahyadri being an exception, I wouldn't consider that as a norm. Leaving that aside, that you have worked with where you see that growth happening beyond the 3 years and they're able to, generate some revenue. And another example where this FPO was in the 90% and had to be reoriented. If you can share these two examples, I think that will help visualize, how the situation on the ground is.
Right. Yeah. Just to give you an example that we have supported is the Nagalgidda Farmer Producer Organization based out of Jogipet, Narayankhed in Medak district, the Sangareddy district now. Okay, so that is what that farmer producer organization has done considerable progress actually in terms of sustainability and making themselves profitable actually. The other one is the Jahirabad Farmer Producer Organization based out of Jahirabad, again in Telangana district, which is again supported by ICRISAT actually. So they are the ones who actually help them in terms of business models and also in terms of what kind of a revenue models they need to have it actually. So these are important. Nagalgita has become almost like a 100 crore company because of various reasons like the commodity being cotton, they are able to sell the seeds, they're able to sell the outputs, and also link themselves up with the ginning factories so that they don't have to sell the cotton or raw cotton, but instead they can actually start selling the bale cotton or the lint. So that is a kind of this thing actually.
And they are backed by ICRISAT, you said, right?
Initially, ICRISAT was also the resource institution for the NABARD this thing. So we actually held them, but at a later stage we have to withdraw actually. Yeah.
So now they are on their own without any.
On their own now.
And how long has this research institution backed them in the early process?
3 years we have
3
been
years.
supported. Yeah.
Okay. And how many members do they have right now?
I don't remember. Close to around 1,000 members now.
Okay. But do you think if ICRISAT had not supported them early in the process, do you think these FPOs would have made it this far or made it this big?
No, more than anything else, it is the leadership that matters actually. So that's what the promoters and the leadership that is actually making a lot of difference actually. See, even if we are going to support, ultimately it is the farmer producer organization who has to execute the business plan. So idea and support is only the 10%. The 90% is actually how do they execute the business plan and what kind of a leadership vision and mission they have actually. So those becomes very important. And that is what need to be inculcated in all the farmer producer organization.
All right. Now, the other side of the extreme where the FPO was not able to survive and went through some sort of reorientation. Do you have any example along those lines? Or any FPO that was not able to survive after the issue?
Actually, there are the numbers are many. I don't want to name them actually, but
yeah, you can just give some example without naming the FPO. That's fine.
Right. So there are few FPOs. They are not able to survive because of see again small and marginal farmers. What happens is the kind of a value chains they work around are something like the paddy rice or the red gram or those kind of a millets or those kind of a programs actually. So which are very the volume is low and also the value is low, which will not be in a position to actually take care of their whatever the compliance expenses or overheads actually. So in that kind of a scenario, it becomes a bit of a challenge, and also because of poor leadership, I would say they were not able to actually graduate themselves to the next level.
Yeah. Got it. But don't you think the reality of rural-based, farmers is that most of the cultivation of crops is around the food crops, right?
Exactly.
And not everybody is involved in growing commercial crops, cash crops.
Yeah. Right.
So in that context, don't you think it should be the other way around, that FPO should really make the food crops more viable and the entire support structure should be geared around that rather than having the cash crops? Because the commercial crops, they can survive, I mean, if I can say that, even without the FPOs.
Right, yeah. So I think what really matters is as a policy for the government, they need to really look into those kind of a support mechanisms. How do they actually support the the food crops promoting farmer producer organization actually. So that becomes the other thing is like they need to really look into what kind of a revenue models they can put it into place. See, food crops also has certain revenue models which could be in the form of inputs, or it could be in the form of market linkages, or it could be in the form of financial linkages. Because food crops has the biggest challenge is in realizing better prices for their members actually. So just by connecting to the existing marketplaces or existing aggregators, so it doesn't really make them viable actually. But at the same time, what the opportunity they have is the in terms of the volumes actually. Most of the food crops, they are produced in volumes actually, and that is how although it could be a low margin, high volume business, they need to figure out what could be the aggregation mechanism actually. How expeditiously or how efficiently they can actually aggregate the produce from the members and then connect directly to the processors. So that the kind of a thought process that need to really go into, especially when they are when the farmer producer organizations are in and around food crops.
Got it. Got it. All right. Thank you. Now, finally, one last question. Given all the work that you have been doing in this field, what are 3 things or what are the 5 things that you would want to change in terms of the policy itself to make these FPOs truly independent and really survive, go beyond their survival?
Right. So one is it is not as I was keep on mentioning that the business acumen is one thing that is missing out actually, and this is where the public-private partnership actually come in actually. So the farmer producer organization need to be promoted as a public-private partnership initiative rather than as a what do you call a not-for-profit or a NGO promoted institutions actually. So that's what I was saying. They're very good in the social capital, but how do they actually orient themselves to the business kind of a thing? And this is where the private parties would come in actually. Of course, the private parties have their own agenda, but it becomes important to have those kind of learnings from the private organization in terms of meeting their requirements, in terms of building the efficiencies, in terms of actually working on the business strategy, and those kind of related things. The private sector would be able to bring it to the table, and then that is how a robust FPO ecosystem can evolve actually.
Right. Great. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mr. Purushottam. I love the conversation. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, my pleasure always. Thank you. Take care. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you.